Thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome to the Camden Opera House. It's great that you're here. It's great to all the folks that are watching this on Facebook streaming at home. Thank you for that. And we've had a great fall, a successful and healthy fall. And as you can see, we've got everybody spaced, and we intend to keep doing that. We're really following the main state guidelines. And we're wearing masks, and we thank you all for wearing your masks as well. We have some things coming up, which I'll talk about briefly. Next Friday, we have Songs for Hope. 3 wonderful singer-songwriters will be playing. It's a stream-only show, so don't come, but watch it on Facebook. And it's a benefit for New Hope for Women, so they'll be obviously accepting donations, and you'll hear about how to do that. So that's a really important show. And then the following Friday, we have Tom Luther. Tom has played here. He's a jazz pianist and a composer, and he's bringing a group in to play some really original new music, which with 45 people here should be really kind of wild. So that's on the 25th. I'd like to thank a lot of people. Certainly Dave Morrison for putting this all together with his wonderful team, Juniper, the tech person, Beth, who has been here running these shows, and it's really been a terrific thing to have some live entertainment back in town. Today, we have 2 amazing things. As a kid who grew up both listening to, going to concerts, and playing rock and roll, today is right up my alley. First off is somebody we all know and love, Dave Morrison, who will be reading from his poetry book, Clubland. Dave was a rocker, an original rocker, both in Boston area and in New York. Moved up here and sort of settled down. Anyway, he, as you know, he's had 15 books out. He's a wonderful poet, and he'll be reading from Clubland today. And then second, and there's not going to be an intermission, so stay in your seats. It's an hour total. We have Ellen Sander, and I just got done reading her book, Trips. It's cool. It's online if you want to buy it. It's a great history of rock and roll, starting with sort of observations from the 50s, but she was there at the beginning. She was at the Fillmore, she was out west, she was at Woodstock, she was at Monterey Pop, and her anecdotes, her critiques, her writings are fantastic. So I recommend the book, and I also recommend, you'll see here in about a half an hour. As has been said of the book, it's a memoir, it's a source book, and it's a love letter to rock and roll. So if you like rock and roll as much as I do, you're going to love today. So without further ado, Dave Morrison.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody. It's great to see you. I grew up as a kid reading everything I could get my hands on about rock and roll. I read Crawdaddy and Cream and Hit Parader and Rolling Stone and Guitar Player. And eventually it occurred to me that while there is a lot of books written by and about rock stars, there were not books written about just the workaday rock and roll players. You know, the men and women who drive the van and hump the gear and have to get up for work on Monday. And there were certainly none that were written as sonnets or sestinas or triolets. So I saw my opening, and now there is one. So all the stories are true, for better or worse. They're in roughly chronological order. And I would like to start with a poem about my very first club gig. I was 17 years old. I was officially a senior in high school. It's called Long Way to the Top. Laconia Lounge in Lowell, Mass. Cross-dressers, thugs, and working stiffs. An ancient waitress who could kick your ass. the smell of pine saw, beer, and piss. Two fat brothers owned the place, shoulder holsters, Hawaiian shirts, Telly and Louie, but not to their face. They called you hey, you called them sir. Jukebox, cigarette machine, one window the size of a postage stamp. Naugahyde booths that won't come clean, tattered carpet that's always damp. Locals bark bizarre requests, Zappa, Bowie, ELO. 7 minutes between each set. You don't dare go to the can alone. The band got fired after 2 nights of a 5-night gig, a punch in the gut. The agent said, it's a stepping stone, but he never said to what. This, like all good poems, is very short and is dedicated to Bunratty's in Allston, Mass. It's called Come On. She pierced his ear in the ladies' room, a pin sterilized with Tanqueray. Through the wall, the band was all crash and boom. It was just another Saturday. But a Saturday night should not be missed. These moments just don't last that long. She smiled and grabbed him by his wrist. Come on, she said. I love this song. So the songs in this, Freudian slip, the poems in this particular collection are of a certain time and place, and that place is Boston. But the truth is, it could be anywhere. It could be any city, large or small, where there's clubs and bands and young people who need to get out. This is called Walking Home. The morning traffic jams up Storrow Drive like thoroughbreds bunched up along the rail. Sun gilds the buildings on the Cambridge side. Charles River hosts no boat, no shell, no sail. He runs the gauntlet, makes it through alive, and having crossed, then vaults over the rail. He can't remember where the party was, even though he only barely left. The crisp air kills the remnants of his buzz. He pats his pockets for his cigarettes. Home to Allston, clean up quick, because this week he works the 8 a.m. shift. The girl he likes is a singer in a band. Her bangs almost completely hide her eyes. They talked a lot at gigs, and so he planned to show up at the party. Hey, surprise. And drink and dance and maybe take her hand and kiss her as the sun began to rise. But when he got there, she had disappeared, doing lines with the owner of the bar. The bathtub had been filled with ice and beer. Someone brought out a battered old guitar. When she came back, she whispered in his ear, can you loan me $10 to get a car? So she didn't kiss his mouth, just his cheek in sisterly gratitude, and off she went. They didn't touch. They didn't hardly speak. And now his own cab money has been spent. He'll probably see her at the gig next week. At least he will be in his element. The morning traffic jams up Storrow Drive like thoroughbreds bunched up along the rail. Sun gilds the buildings on the Cambridge side. Charles River hosts no boat, no shell, no sail. All in all, it's good to be alive. It's good to try. It's even good to fail. So, in this book, there are archetypes, sort of characters that you see in any area. So this is one of them. This poem is called The Manager, and I would note that this is the band manager as opposed to the club manager. The manager. He told us he'd run lights for ELO. Eyes bright, he listed all his famous friends. And Coke, he always had a stash of Coke to get things done and help tie up loose ends. Don't leave home without it, was his joke. As far as we could tell, he never did. He had a dozen schemes ready to go, and a dancer girlfriend, practically a kid. He lined up big-time gigs in concert halls, and even if a lot of them fell through, the sense of possibility felt real. Young and hungry, we swore we would do anything it took to close the deal, to climb the ladder out of local bars, to show we had the talent and the balls to prove that we deserved to become stars. But pretty soon the cracks began to show. We found out people weren't getting paid. The rumors of our burgeoning success were looked upon as just one more charade. More gigs got canceled, finances a mess. We finally confronted him with facts. He acted crushed. In fact, he looked as though we had cruelly stabbed him in the back. We learned the line is thin between a lie and something that is not exactly true. And that when caution squares off with a desire, most times desire will beat it black and blue. He was our champion. He was a liar. We were so hungry we didn't see the signs. It wasn't just the Coke that made him blind to the subtle answers there between the lines. I still don't think the whole plan was conceived to line his pockets. No, I think he was addicted to the image of himself as hero and to gratitude and buzz. He loved to hustle well above all else. We hated the deception and the waste. And to this day, I think that he believed it crashed and burned because we lost our faith. So we were based out of Boston. We played all over New England. And we had a booking agent who had some connections in Maine. So we played in Maine a lot. We played Portland a lot. We played Orono. We played Waterville. We played Augusta. We played Camden, about 40 feet behind me, Mr. Kites. Oh, yeah. And we played Old Orchard Beach. A gig for 2 nights at a club by the beach, walking in sand with our sharp Cuban heels. Waves in the distance, stars within reach. A gig for 2 nights at a club by the beach. We're up from the city. They can tell by our speech. We smoke cigarettes by the Ferris wheel. Black leather jackets, club by the beach, walking in sand with our sharp Cuban heels. The gigs take us farther away from our home in Boston, a ramshackle house by the pike. We're looking for work with a fine-tooth comb. The gigs take us farther away from our home. From Portland to Amherst to Hartford we roam. We'll play any club that has sound and lights. Some nights we forget that we have a home in Boston, a ramshackle house by the pike. This week we headline a bar by the sand. Next week, New Haven, then Cambridge, then Maine. 40 minutes on stage, 4 hours in the van. This week we headline a bar by the sand. We're writing new songs, we're hatching new plans, but any momentum feels hard to sustain. Days run through our fingers, just like the sand. Next week, New Haven, then Cambridge, then Maine, then Beverly, Manchester, Worcester, Lynn, Methuen, Northampton, Somerville, then Boston, then Gloucester, then we start again. Beverly, Manchester, Worcester, Lynn. If we don't get some airplay, if the crowd starts to thin, we'll run out of money. We'll run out of will. Beverly, Manchester, Worcester, Lynn, Methuen, Northampton, Somerville. So everyone is heroes, particularly when you're playing a band. And one of mine was Pete Townsend, which was a good-bad thing. It was good because he was sort of a brilliant composer and lyricist and a wild guitar player. It was not such a good thing because of some behavioral issues. This is called Broken Guitar. He'd seen The Who 100 times on film, smash their gear before they left the stage. He couldn't tell. Was it glee or was it rage? A modern vestige of kill or be killed. One night during encore, while the feedback died, he spun his Gibson hard against the wall. The crowd went wild. He held the pieces high as if he were the winner of a brawl. Alone, he almost wept for what he'd done. He might as well have cut out his own tongue. So this one is about the club manager. This one provided me with a very big kick because it got read by Garrison Keillor, which is a surreal experience to hear that sort of thing. But this was included in Writer's Almanac, which was great fun. The irony of this particular poem, I think I can say, is that it was written from the perspective of someone who had to deal with the club manager, and now I've sort of become the club manager. Be careful what you do when you write poems. The club manager. His office is behind the stage, behind a thick, scarred wooden door. A desk piled high with bills, receipts, a small safe bolted to the floor. Envious friends say, man, how sweet to be the guy behind the scene. He puts aside the payroll page. It's time to fix the ice machine. The overhead is suffocating. Electric, rent, insurance, beer, the mobbed up dumpster, glassware, liquor, mics, cables, amps, repair, advertising, ASCAP sticker, bar staff, wait staff, bouncers, sound. The owner talks of relocating. You might as well just burn it down. Bands talk of blood and sweat and tears. They want more money, better dates. He knows that if they don't sell drinks, there's no point to unlock the grates. Sometimes, worn out, alone, he thinks, I'm through. I can't last one more week. But reconsiders when he hears cheers, clapping, whistles, stamping feet. This is never enough. Forehead against the window. The van rolls through the darkness. You drink too much at gigs, and so you're rarely behind the wheel. The radio plays softly, the whiff of beer and gasoline, home to get 4 hours of sleep. You're not sure what to feel. You played a club in Beverly called Grover's by the train tracks. A headline on a Thursday, a surprisingly good crowd. A chance to win them over, a chance to get it right this time, a chance to keep your balance and not play too fast, too loud, but you let friends buy you whiskeys and everyone knows your brand by now. Instead of getting ready, you were hanging by the bar. Someone had to come find you. You threw everyone's rhythm off. You talked too much. You pushed too hard. You acted like a star. And maybe no one noticed. The people stomped and shouted. The owner comped you all a drink and said, hey, kid, nice show. And on your way to the dressing room, some pretty, sweaty lovelies gave you big-eyed smiles. Of course, that could have been the blow. But alone, you know the difference, and it makes you feel like a swindler. You wish you could be gracious, but the compliments all feel wrong, because you've heard the songs in your head sound like a symphony on a battleground, like a shiny new machine, or like a prayer, or a gong. You know the music's potential. It's worked its alchemy on you. You feel it like a red-hot coal that's lodged inside your chest. And once you felt it burn you, and once you've prayed for that torment, that mix of love and sadness will never let you rest. So you didn't trust the power, and you didn't give in to the moment. You didn't love your audience or hit it out of the park. You didn't join your heroes or rise to meet the challenge. You didn't stay loose and funky. You didn't fan the spark. You didn't make them love you. You didn't make them love you. You didn't make them love you. Now you're riding home in the dark. This one is for a lot of my guitar player friends, but right now it's for my friend Matt Brown. This is called The Guitar Player. He waited for the bartender to close. His gear was packed and stacked beside the door. You can't enjoy the highs without the lows. The gigs were becoming something of a chore. The sameness had anesthetized the dream till he forgot what he was pushing for. The waitress poured herself a short Jim Beam. He remembered when she fronted her own band. With headphones on, she wiped each table clean. He left his cigarettes out in the van. He wanted to get paid, go home to sleep. Next weekend was another two-night stand. He waited for the bartender to close. You can't enjoy the highs without the lows. Oh, thank you so much. Well, I'm going to end with this one, but I would like to thank you for coming. That's so great to see you, symbolically speaking. And for everyone who's tuning in, nice going. So thank you for listening. Ellen Sanders up next. Don't forget to tip your bartenders and waitresses. And as every bouncer ever said, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. This is called Life Amplified. Good Coke was like an angel's hungry kiss, a moment of electric clarity that made your timid pulse pound in your wrists with a burning sense of possibility. We couldn't bear to let that wildness pass. We didn't know it wasn't meant to last. On stage, we made a sound like a machine that threw off light and heat and made sparks fly. It ran on whiskey, hunger, and caffeine, distracting us from the daylight world outside. And though it was a hammer made of glass, we couldn't believe it wasn't meant to last. We were indestructible and young, propelled by our obsession and desire. The real part of our lives had just begun, even if our wings were catching fire. Our way was pushing hard and moving fast, a life that simply wasn't meant to last. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out. Thank you to everybody at the Camden Opera House for arranging this. How's it sound? Good, good. Okay. So I wrote this book about my career in rock and roll journalism, part memoir, part history, and it's recently been reissued in an augmented edition. I didn't change a whole lot. You know, I wanted to keep it the way I wrote it, pretty much, but I took out some embarrassing things. But I wanted, when Dave introduced himself, he mentioned that he was reading Crawdaddy. The editor and founder of Crawdaddy, 19-year-old Paul Williams, was a very, very close friend of mine and a great influence. And it was very heartening to hear Dave mention him. Dave and I read together the first time in the winter of 2007 in an ice cream shop in Belfast. And he read some stuff from Clubland and from some of his other books, and I thought, there's a kindred soul. So I am so happy to be on the same stage with him again. We're going to start. Paul Williams, as I said, was a great influence on me, but there were a lot of other things that kind of kick-started my my career, and one of them was, because I was independent, I didn't work for any particular publication, so a lot of the times I'd be like traveling around on my own nickel and selling pieces afterwards, and then after a while, of course, I got assignments in advance. But in the beginning, one of the things that kick-started me was in 1966, youth airfare was initiated. Far as you wanted to go, stand by at half price. 70 some odd dollars to California from the East Coast, one way, and hundreds of thousands of young people took that trip. Life was so different once you learned to fly, and people under 22 began putting time and distance behind them, the terrestrial world below them, taking long-distance flights with less hesitation than their parents would make a long-distance phone call. You remember. It might be raining on the ground, raining all around, but up in the jet stream where the birds were singing, the clouds, a frail carpet below, there was always pure, sweet air, speed, clear skies, and shining sun. It's always lovely weather. You just have to get high enough. Hitchhiking up and down the mental and geographical wilderness of the incredibly beautiful California coastline, hanging out on the Strip in LA, communing in Big Sur, living collectively in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, a mobile underground developed encompassing so many artists, musicians, and kids who were on the road that they learned that wherever you were, if there was rock and roll music happening in any form nearby, you could find friends, shelter, dope, adventure, and sex. Mentally and physically, America's turned-on youth flew as naturally as they walked. Los Angeles had always been a very special place for music, and its rock and roll contained so much of its magic. There had been the surfing music early in the 60s, the Beach Boys and the Surfaris, and that heavy chorded sound of the sea, the cars, and the tans, the clear blue eyes, diamond droplets shining off beautiful shoulders, packs and packs of kids on the beach at sunrise, surfing into the new morning. It was another world, the beautiful coastal paradise of extremes, and its children with sun-bleached eyebrows were growing up in Never Never Land, free, naked, long-limbed, and beautiful, standing loose on a shaped fiberglass plank, riding the sea, walking on the water like Jesus, getting very high on the sun and the air and the tide, and into such heavy emotional ties with the elements that all they could utter were epithets to express their exhilaration. What a beautiful sound. It carried the magic and grace of the height of teenism in flower, torment forgotten, lost in the salty wind and shriek of zippy cars. Those harmonies, those Beach Boys sound twines, growing fuller and fuller, resonating, peaking, clearing, diving, wiping out. From that sound, the rest of the nation teens could just feel something happening over there, out west in California. You could hear the sound in the canyons and the hills behind Hollywood. Laurel Canyon, a network of snaggled mini mountain roads with cottages and chalets and all manners of quixotic compact architecture, snuggled close to the hills that rise abruptly from Sunset Boulevard into a world nestled in greenery, cluttered with half-hidden houses where most of the Los Angeles pop musicians lived. The wind comes down the crease in the hill, and it whistles up against the walls, maybe carrying music from a band rehearsing up the hill. And now and again, on one of those timeless days, a jet flying overhead and with the wind hits a harmony for a brief instant, a quick sound that resonates through the canyon and lingers for a moment in the air before it fades. So one of the bands to come out of California, and by the time I got to Laurel Canyon, they were living there, they had moved there from Venice Beach, was The Doors. And I wanted to read you an account of a Doors concert in, I think it was probably 1969 that I went to. I'm going to try to balance my readings between places, personalities, and events. 177. 227. Here we go. The Doors and The Who had been booked as a double bill in the Singer Bowl at the World's Fair site in New York. So this was like maybe 45 minutes out of the city. The Doors and The Who on one bill. Can you imagine? You know. So I was definitely going to go to that. It was coming toward the end of a long, hot summer in New York, an irritable scene that sharply contrasted the mellow Los Angeles climate from which the Doors had flown in from New York to play. They were at a slick motel getting ready to leave for the gig. A film crew was traveling with the Doors, another of the countless attempts at rock verite. Cameraman Babe Hill was anticipating a good night for shooting. There had already been some trouble. The Who don't want the Doors' equipment on stage, Hill muttered as he prepared his gear. They're sore because they didn't get top billing, and they're threatening to wreck the Doors setup if it's on the stage. It was a sticky hot night, and the Singer Bowl is large. There would be kids in from all the boroughs that evening, and the concert had long been sold out. It looked like a good possibility for some kind of trouble. That's what we want, said Hill. Film of unruly kids. The film crew loaded themselves and their gear into one limousine and waited for Jim Morrison to appear. The rest of the Doors got into a second limousine and promptly drove off toward Queens. Morrison walked through the lobby doors of the motel to the delighted murmur of about 25 kids waiting on the sidewalk. Wordlessly, with his head down, he got in and closed the door behind him. Morrison was the one cool renegade to reign over the pop scene for a length of time, whose style and personality differed vastly from his fellow superstars. He was an arrogant loner, the enfant terrible, a mystery poet of mystical liberation. He was a pro, a performer who could manipulate an audience with invisible reins, steering them through the deep complexities of his songs and movements. He could silence them with a stroke of his hand. He could arouse them with a primal scream. He could unleash them into his own vision of theater, set them free of even his own control. The band behind him was a threesome of impeccable timing and musicianship. Together they were synergism. They rose to the top, arched their heads with stroke after masterful stroke, and then began to topple wildly. Morrison and the boys had grown apart. He was too crazy, too unreliable, too intellectual, and too conceited for them, but mostly he was too insecure. They shunned him socially, and he retaliated by terrorizing them with the threat that he would quit. He was lonely, as all writers must be, and he was outrageous in public, often drinking himself blind and creating a scene. He considered himself a poet, rock and roll his vehicle. He was also an actor, a cinematographer, a screenwriter, and a rather pleasant guy when he wasn't acting out. In contrast to the arrogance and depravity he projected on the rock and roll stage, he was endearingly bashful, particularly at the height of his fame. He affected indifference, aped bravado, and generally gave the appearance of deep thought, glib observation, or helpless stupor, all covers under which he could size up a scene, which was often galvanized by his very presence there. He sat that night in the back right-hand seat of his limousine, flipping pages of the Village Voice back and forth and mumbling about nothing happening in New York. He tossed the paper to the floor and began to sing Eleanor Rigby, scattering the lyrics into gibberish. "You're weird, man," said Babe Hill. Delighted Morrison grinned. "I tries," he drawled, settling back into the back of his seat. The driver lost his way close to the Singer Bowl. Someone made a nervous joke about time. "This is anarchy," Morrison accused the driver. The limousine became tangled in the traffic jam around the Singer Bowl. As it finally rounded the bend toward the stage entrance, a crowd of fans charged it. They ran up to the car, which stopped halfway to the building to avoid running them over. They ganged it, pressing hands and faces to the windows. Before someone could reach across Morrison's chest to snap the door lock closed, he opened it. Hands reached in and bodies followed. The car was full of kids playfully grabbing at Morrison, who winced and hung limp. "Will some of you girls escort me backstage?" he asked huskily. "I might get mobbed or something." The backstage area was a locker room in a cement cubicle, rather large but very hot and steamy. Jim decided he wanted to walk around outside, checking to see that the cameramen were behind him. He got about 20 feet before he was noticed, then hundreds of people mobbed him. It was an evening destined to go askew. It was just in the air. During the Who set, a revolving stage malfunctioned and got stuck. A portion of the audience couldn't see, and they were getting mad. The Who played badly, and the drama of their breakup finale was taken down a peg by an equipment man in full sight, as the stage was in the ground, lighting smoke bombs behind the amplifiers. But the crowd was roaring. There were 15,000 of them, and they were in the mood for some action. The Who left the stage in a foul mood. The Doors took their time going on. A half hour passed, and then an hour. The audience was frothing. They pounded loudly and rhythmically, demanding the Doors. The band, Krieger, Densmore, and Manzarek, appeared on stage and vamped, waiting for Morrison, who was very deliberately taking his sweet time. He stepped out of the doorway, and a cry went up through the audience. He smiled, posed, drew him up intensely. I thought I saw him shiver. The sound of the crowd changed. It was voracious, vicious, predatory. Girls hung over the tier, sobbing. He was escorted by a cordon of security police to the stage through people who leaped at him. He lifted the microphone and began to sing. A good portion of the audience still couldn't see, and they were furious. Crowds stormed the front of the stage and were turned back by police. The set proceeded sporadically, further infuriating the crowd. Some were trying to scale the stage and others cheered them on. Morrison spun around and ground the songs out half-heartedly, ad-libbing, improvising, doing an ominous dance. Hysteria was building. "Cool down," he urged seductively. "We're going to be here for a long time." "Light my fire," the audience demanded. "Light my fire." Morrison shrieked, moaned, gyrated, and minced to the edge of the stage, hovering. Hands reached out and grabbed him, and the cops had to pry them away. The camera crew ducked a piece of broken chair which came flying out onto the stage. Morrison caught it and heaved it back into the crowd. Moments later, it was thrown again by someone in the audience and came sailing through the air again, hitting a girl on the head and cutting her. The Doors were hardly visible from any angle because there were about 20 cops on stage. The set ended under great protest, and the Doors had to be dragged by police through a tunnel of fighting kids. Everyone not with the Doors party was removed, some forcibly from the backstage area, which was then locked up tight. The audience banged on the doors and the walls. It was like being under siege. A few cans of beer were passed around to fill the time it took to clear the arena. Jim Morrison was in the hall talking to the injured girl. Densmore was batting an empty beer can against the wall with a stick of wood he'd found. He then threw the slab of wood angrily against the wall, picked up a mop, propped up in the corner of the room, took it into an empty arena, mounted the stage, and began swabbing it down. He called for the cameramen to shoot it, cursed when they remained with Morrison. Morrison came back into the dressing room. "Do you think it looked phony, me talking to her?" he asked, nobody in particular. Nobody answered. The area was cleared, and the doors headed back toward the limousine for the return trip. This time, John Densmore and Jim Morrison rode together. "That was a weird gig," said Densmore. "If those kids really got together and figured we're 15,000 and they're only a couple hundred cops, they'd really do something. I can't decide if I dig it or I don't. Do you dig it, Jim?" "They'd really do a revolt thing if I jumped off the stage, wouldn't they?" asked Morrison. "You get pretty messed up, man." "Oh, we should do something. They were throwing things and stuff." "I threw them about 20 drumsticks." "We ought to throw money. Yes, let's get a few hundred ones and throw them into the crowd. It'll be great for the movie." One of the cameramen laughed. "Movie, hell. I'm not going to be shooting. I'm going to be picking up the bread." John's head was back at the concert, trying to piece it together from his point of view. All that unrest, he mused. Thank you. As you might imagine, I met some amazing people, men and women, and one of them was Cass Elliot. And I remember, when, and the Mamas and Papas were, very early progenitors. They had kind of this combination of good time music and rock and roll. They were amazing musicians and performers. And I remember when Janis Joplin hit it big, and Ellen Willis, who wrote for The New Yorker, and she and I were always getting confused because everybody's named Ellen now. But she was far the better writer and, had an enormous background. But she kind of had a she was a feminist, I was not, and I always thought that, she had a kind of skewed view of things. At least it was different from mine. For one thing, when Janis Joplin hit it big, she wrote a piece about her, very favorable. Everybody was very excited about Janis, and she was saying, it's amazing, one of the points at the beginning of the piece, that someone like that, someone who looked like that could be a rock star, what that does for women. And I thought to myself, excuse me, do you remember Cass Elliot? A very large woman who was actually pregnant, nobody knew it until she had the baby, but, and a large, beautiful woman with a gorgeous voice who was one of the centerpieces of a band that was full of centerpieces. So I got to interview Cass after the Mamas and the Papas broke up and after a kind of failed attempt at a Las Vegas show. And she had some very interesting takes on herself, women in the music business, and her own career. And being a woman who looks like she did, which I think maybe would interest you. But I want to start with back in Greenwich Village, where sort of rock and roll really started because it came out of the folk movement. She had something to say during the interview about living in Greenwich Village, and it's in the chapter about Greenwich Village. People say, boy, those must have been tough days, reminisced Cass Elliot. I lived in a $36 a month apartment that had a John in the hall and was constantly being burglarized, but I had a great time. I worked for $40 a week under the table as a hat check girl in a nightclub. At the Night Owl singing with Tim Rose, I was making $2 every other night, when the year before I'd been making $50,000 as an actress. I don't actually believe that, but she said it. It's in quotes. That was when the Spoonful were just starting out. Tim Hardin and Richie Havens were also working there. It was fresh and it was wonderful. We were all young kids feeling the wind in our hair. We were making music and listening and doing a lot of walking. We were free. We did what we had to do to keep ourselves alive. My apartment was on 4th Street and Avenue C. The electricity had been turned off because I couldn't pay the bill, but it was fine. I used candles. There was an innocence you just don't find that way again. Later on, when it got successful, when it got down to money, the innocence was all gone. We all learned a lot from each other back then, but rock and roll is a tremendously competitive business. There's no reciprocity into it. When it came down to dollars, everyone got uptight. Probably the biggest bring down in my life, it's so hypocritical, was that being at a big pop group and finding out just how much it was like everything it was supposed to be against. And I'm going to actually read 201 from the piece that I wrote out of that interview. Here we go. It is said of some that they are born stars, and if that is indeed true, one of those must surely be Cass Elliot, Earth Mother of the Mamas and Papas, and in her time, the grande dame of rock and roll. She always exerted a presence on the scene, always the articulate highlight of any one of the many television shows on which she's appeared, save her own special, but more about that later. She defends it hotly. The TV show was the last time she ever resisted asserting herself with whomever she worked. Not doing so was perhaps a bad habit left over from being excluded from the business end of her life for what turned out to be too long. When I was touring with the Mamas and Papas, I felt I was kept from a lot of things I should have known. There are a lot of decisions you have to make out there that no one can make for you. Things like money and coordinating interviews. The Mamas and the Papas was a tremendously symbiotic relationship. John was the father figure. He handled everything, the business, the contract, where we would work, where we wouldn't work. And there was sort of a tacit agreement, because the three of them had been singing together before I joined them, that I would not become involved with the business. It was never explained to me. Though she resented that arrangement at the time, she regretfully accepted it. It turned out to be a symptom of what was generally amiss with the group. I don't know whether it was because John felt threatened by me or that it was just easier for one person to handle it, but the end result was that I didn't really know much about what was happening. Later on, she found the same attitude recurrent, even when she tried to handle or at least inform herself about the business end of her career. You always find that record executives tend to treat a woman in a slightly conciliatory way, pat you on the head. I know how to do my job. I've been doing it for 10 years. Let me do it. I learned a lot about the business since, and I have an instinctive thing. I know what's right for me. Being alone, I had to learn to exert more control over it. When I did my TV special, the people who produced it and wrote it had no idea who I was. No idea. And they had written all this stuff, and it was just a nightmare. I wanted the audience up close, everybody to be part of what was happening. Television verite. So I sat out on the front of the stage and rapped with the audience. The first thing they did was cut all that out. After she left the Mamas and Papas, she opened in Las Vegas, which was a colossal bomb, the inappropriateness of which was made much of in critical circles. I had this tremendous vision of going to Las Vegas and blowing the top off of it, just doing a very honest, unprepared set where I talked to the people, type of show that had never been done there. I didn't want a prepared act, but my advisor said, have an act. Mason Williams wrote me an act. I looked at it and said, I can't say these things. I can't just go on and say that it's me and Julie Andrews fighting it out for these parts. It might be funny, but it's just not me. The unhappy reminiscences concluded, she said. Now I've reached a position in my career where I can say no. There had been many other lessons learned along the way, things you'd never expect to come up, but then there they are, and you have to, in the middle of the dizzy circus that was rock and roll stardom, deal with them. There was a certain amount of jealousy between myself and Michelle, not just because she was pretty, but because she was with John. It made it a little easier for her. It's not very easy to run around a lot. If you're successful in the business and you want to be somebody's old lady and he's not as successful as you are, ultimately it gets to him. It has interfered. The tighter you are with the people you're working with, the easier it is. The reason I left the group the first time is because I couldn't take the loneliness of the road. I worked up until the 8th month of my pregnancy. It got pretty difficult. On our last dates, I had to do the second set sitting down because I went into false labor. I was really overweight. I weighed about 300 pounds, and I couldn't jump around and dance. After that, we recorded an album called Deliver. Among other indignities she recalls, with resolve and distaste, she said out of nowhere, "I don't like the constant inference that I was on drugs and screwing everybody." Whether stardom is a born or an acquired attribute can be argued. With Cass, it doesn't really matter. She is one of those rare stars that can speak openly, honestly, blowing myths with every sentence without dissolving the excitement or the strength of a stellar personality. It comes with experience. It comes with the ups and downs of an erratic career. It comes with the incredible confidence she has, and much of it, she enjoyed telling me, came with motherhood. You lie less to yourself when you're a mother. You cannot bullshit a child. I told Owen, her daughter, when she was very little, that I couldn't be super patient with her. I'm not a super patient person. I had to explain that to her because when I had a screaming temper fit, she would wonder who this stranger was. Surprised, I asked if a child understands that. You're damn right she understood. Kids understand. I became more concerned about ecology because of Owen. Motherhood is the first time in your life when you think of somebody else first. Even when you're in love, you don't always think of somebody else first. When you have children, you're concerned about them. And I'm concerned about the fact that she might not have air to breathe. I think to myself some nights when I come home, I've been working 16 or 17 hours and I'm tired. Wouldn't it be nice to have a man who really loves you, a couple of kids, stay at home, cook dinner, rather than get up at 6 in the morning and be Miss Show Business? Sometimes I just say, screw it, stay around the house, but I know I can't do that. I may get incredibly bored in 6 months, go batty from it, but I just don't know because I've never had it. I'm not your basic type of girl. I dropped out of high school. It was the only way I could get out of going to college because my parents had me enrolled already. I was of age and I just quit, hung around for a while, and then decided to go into show business because my girlfriend was in it. When I got married, I didn't know what I think was supposed to happen, but it didn't happen. I mentioned the general impression when she had the baby that she wasn't married. I was married when I had the baby, she grinned, conveniently enough. She looked at the ceiling and laughed to herself. And that's all I'm going to say about that. It's complicated. She was married, but not to the father of the child. This is Cass speaking again now. I'm much older now. I'm 30, and basically I want to tell you that I don't think a woman can be a father to a child. I've been going with a guy for 8 years now, before and after I got married, and now we're thinking about getting married. I guess I have kind of old-fashioned ideas, or maybe it's just me. When you've been fat all your life and insecure about it, I find I need the security of being chosen and loved and being married. Cass Elliot was and remains a unique and irreplaceable voice. Thank you so much. I also wrote some poetry about rock and roll, not to the extent that Dave did for sure, and not from the point of view that Dave did for sure, but I have a couple, and I want to share one with you. It's called Dreamtime 1. I dreamed about John Lennon the other night. I saw him going by and I said, John. Actually, I said, Jean, because I think maybe he'd think I was Yoko and turn around. He turned around. Oh, you, he said. You were always so worried about everything. John, I said, there are no love songs where the man loves the woman anymore. They're killing each other out there. When are we going to get love songs again? Two good things about being dead, John replied. You're older than I am now, and I don't have to answer your fucking questions anymore. Let's see where we are here. Okay, Chuck Berry was an amazing person who I met several times, and I'm going to get to him through some stories about how rock and roll stars were ravers. There was a BBC TV show called Ready, Steady, Go, which was just like the producer just let everybody run wild. So it had some amazing moments and some touching moments too. Beatles, Stones, Animals, and others would come on and play to live audiences. By the time the show came on, they'd all been through the scene of breaking up instruments for a finale, and more than once the stage was completely decimated. There were also shows that radiated the beauty and intimacy of the scene in London, like the one after the Beatles came home from America and they sang to their original champions, happy, satisfied, glowing, with a closeness telecast to thousands so they might feel how much love could be motivated by the trip from which they returned. Once when the Stones came back from America, they did a Ready, Steady, Go with the Animals. You know, Eric Burden and the Animals. I'm not trying to intimate that this... okay, at the time, everyone was a camera freak. Ringo had gotten a camera, monkey see, monkey do. Backstage with the Animals, Mick Jagger and Charlie Watts were clicking shutters and dials and bullshitting f-stops and ASA ratings because none of them really knew the first thing about their newly acquired equipment. The loudspeaker crackled in the dressing room. Rolling Stones to the stage, and the Stones split, leaving their cameras behind with the Animals. Eric Burden grabbed Mick Jagger's camera and gave it to Chaz Chandler, who actually knew how to work a camera. And Burden dropped his pants, and Chaz snapped a picture of his private parts, perfectly exposed, and then replaced the camera in Mick's pile of clothes. Several days later, Jagger caught up with Burden, and he was hopping mad. He'd given a roll of film to Chrissy Shrimpton, Gene's younger sister, whom Mick had been dating, and she'd taken it in for processing, only to be confronted by a leering clerk when she went to pick it up. She really dressed Mick down for it, and he was furious. It didn't take him a second to figure out it was Burden's handiwork. Burden just laughed and laughed. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Another time when the Animals were playing a set with Geordie Fame and the Blue Flames, the Animals scampered on stage just as the curtain was going up on Fame and the others and stuck some amy's up their noses, amyl nitrate capsules. The Blue Flames went crazy, running into another, howling and falling down, and a few minutes later there was nothing left on the stage. The sound system was all over the floor, and it was only the beginning of their set. They vowed revenge on the Animals, but Eric and his boys were only cooking up the next one. The next time the two groups played the same bill, the Animals started early, capturing a stray dog and starving him. While Georgie Flame and the Blue Flames were on stage in the middle of a heavy ballad, the Animals threw a piece of meat across the stage, and the poor dog trotted out after it with a sign hung across his body, "Eric Burden and the Animals coming up next." Fame had his eyes closed and his glottis open when suddenly the audience went wild. He opened his eyes in the midst of his reverie to find total hysteria had erupted for apparently no reason. The dog got terrified and pissed all over the stage as it ran yowling away. In 1965, when the Animals were in America, they had this dubious fortune to be booked for a concert in Birmingham, Alabama. Although enforced integration of hotels was in effect there, the front desk was not prepared for this load of freaks who would earn more money that night than they would put together all month, and their black roadie. At first, the hotel refused to register them, but relented when the roadie threatened to call the law. Later, when the group got to the concert, for which all the tickets had been sold out, the house was only 1/3 full. Word had gotten out that they had been traveling with a N-word. That's one of the things I took out of the book because I just couldn't bear to see it in print again. I just put a bunch of asterisks in it. And folks kept their kids home. After the concert, all upset, the group went back to the hotel and found the place crawling with cops. What a bring down. Birmingham, Alabama. No girls after a bad gig. Next morning, the airport was empty, whereas on their arrival, thousands of screeching fans had turned out to welcome the Animals. The place had been cleared by the cops before the group got there, and they snickered as the group filed past them through the gates. "Y'all come back and see us again now," one of Birmingham's finest grinned as they passed him. Eric and the black roadie, walking side by side, burst out laughing and replied, "Sure," in unison. "Not you, you black motherfucker," said the cop. "You stay back in New York where you belongs." All the bands in England were trying at one time to outmaneuver each other for an opportunity to tour with Chuck Berry, their idol and inspiration. Somehow the Animals won out and took off for a tour with the master. It turned out to be painfully embarrassing. Carl Perkins was also on the tour, and while he and the Animals got along fine, Chuck Berry was removed and silent the whole trip, which made for a certain amount of discomfort for all involved. Berry, for whatever reason, had just shut himself off. At the end of their last date together, Burden approached Berry and somehow tried to communicate his admiration for the man and his music. "Even though you kept yourself apart from us, you're still my hero," said the young white rocker to the black veteran. "We learned so much from you." Berry softened briefly. His face relaxed into a smile. The folds and hollows of his gaunt visage turned kind and flashy the way he shone on stage. "Thanks," he said. "Our paths will cross again." That was all. He turned and left without another word or a backward glance. A year later, after trips and gigs and hits and flops and crushes of girls and total exhaustion, the Animals were making their way out of the airport in Salt Lake City, Utah, when a thin black figure streaked past them, pausing only long enough to say, "See, I told you I'd see you again." Chuck Berry kept going, and Eric Burden just stood there in amazement. I got a phone call in I think it was 1970. I got a phone call from my girlfriend, Diane Gardner, who you're going to hear about in a minute. And there had just been an earthquake in Los Angeles, a big one. And I was on the East Coast, and I talked to her, and I went, "Are you okay?" And she went, "I'm in love." And it turned out that the person she was in love with was Chuck Berry, who she'd been dating. I was on assignment in Los Angeles. Chuck Berry, who was called Charles in his private life, was dating a friend of mine, the petite, button pretty, sharp as a tack, ebullient, blonde publicist Diane Gardner. Diane and I had plans for the evening. She called in the afternoon to ask if I wouldn't like to go out with her and Charles for the evening, and after making sure I wouldn't be intruding, I happily accepted the change of plans. I went to her apartment in Hollywood at 7600 Fountain Avenue. She lived downstairs from Jim Morrison, who was peeling the fender of his girlfriend's car off the side of the too narrow driveway as I arrived. Shortly after I got there, Charles showed up at the door. After introductions, we walked out to the driveway to Charles' brand new, spanking new RV, a huge, luxuriously appointed land yacht. Charles was a little stiff, and I was afraid either he hadn't been consultant or he hadn't been happy about my joining them for the evening. I'd never seen the inside of an RV before, and Charles graciously showed me around. Everything you could want was there. "Even a commode," said Charles, pointing to a narrow little door toward the back of the cavernous vehicle. Since the RV was so new, he had to put some miles on it before the first local service, so we drove quite a ways up the freeway. Diane, I could tell, wanted to show off at a fancy restaurant, but Charles had other ideas. We drove for more than an hour. Charles was in the right lane with his left turn signal on, and cars kept passing us. He seemed a bit hesitant to change lanes. I said, "Go ahead, Charles. You could put that Chevy in your commode." He flashed me a huge grin, and that's how I knew I was finally okay with him. He sped up handily and changed lanes, smooth as silk. We stopped near Oxnard. When we pulled off the freeway and headed toward a family-style restaurant, Diane voiced her disappointment at such a modest eatery. "I thought you said you wanted chicken, dear," said Charles. The restaurant's marked parking places were too small to accommodate the RV, so Charles parked it alongside of an adjacent gas station, and we crossed the parking lot to get to the restaurant. We entered the restaurant and seated ourselves in a booth, studying the menu, and studying the menu, and studying the menu. I noticed that people who had arrived and been seated after us were getting served. More time went by. We were being conspicuously ignored. I was astonished. Diane was indignant. Charles was sardonic. We'd been there for over 45 minutes and no waitress approached our booth. The moment Diane made a remark about the horrible service, Charles gave a hand signal for us to get up and leave. They weren't going to serve a table with a black man and 2 young white women. We walked silently across the parking lot. A cluster of late teenage boys coming the other way passed us on the way to the restaurant. Behind us, we could hear one of them turn around and exclaim, "Did you see that? Did you see who that was? That was Chuck Berry, fucking Chuck Berry." The other boys turned around in wonder, exchanging epithets as they recognized the tall, brown-eyed, handsome man leaving the scene, shaking his head and smirking at the obscene incongruity of it all. We did not acknowledge the boys. We walked silently back to the luxury RV and got in. In 1977, NASA launched space probes Voyager 1 and 2 to explore the outer solar system. Aboard are golden records filled with information about Earth, including images, sounds, and music intended to represent our planet. The only one rock and roll song in that collection, which Carl Sagan curated, is Chuck Berry's 1958 hit, "Johnny Be Good." Chuck Berry lived long enough to learn that the Voyager made it to interstellar space in 2012. He passed away March 18th, 2017, at the age of 90. And I would like to conclude with the very first rock and roll poem I ever wrote on the inside cover of one of my notebooks that I used to take notes for the stories I was collecting. It's called Stone. Step on this rock that moves underfoot. Spite the street that is dancing. Lashing bodies on the oracle. Black vinyl mandala. The howl of the circle. It comes. It rocks. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dave Morrison, Dagny Ernest, Juniper, and all the people of the Camden Opera House for these wonderful shows that they put on. And thank you all for coming.